rapidly declining.
Official media made a huge deal of it. They rolled out all these posters with 3 children in a family on, smiley faces, smiley-faced children. China has a problem now that the labour market is shrinking because of the one-child policy, because the parents of the children who grew up in the one-child policy are starting to retire, and there are fewer children. There needs to be more people in China in order to take up the labour at the momentum that it's going.
That's the BBC's China media analyst, Kerry Allen, who observed how, despite the official fanfare, public reaction has seemed less than enthusiastic to the news. An initial online straw poll by the official state media found that people voted 28-1 against having more children themselves. The poll was pretty rapidly taken down off the website. These parents of single children captured the sceptical mood.
If there were the right conditions, then we'd have more kids. But nowadays, young people have to buy a house. The amount of pressure is already huge, and then you have to consider the cost of a child's education. I think this policy will be difficult to implement.
And we think the quality of our children's education will be an even bigger issue for having a second or third child.
It's mostly women bearing the responsibility of raising children, and this society hasn't given women much support. Thinking realistically, I don't want to have a second child.
Well, this new 3-child policy is, of course, an update from the tougher restrictions that used to apply. It was back in 1979 when the fear of a possible population bomb in China, leading perhaps to mass starvation, so went the fear, persuaded the world's most populous nation to introduce tough measures against couples having more than one child. These included economic sanctions, forced abortions, even sterilizations. The population went on growing, but at a slower rate in the decades afterwards, and eventually in 2016 this one-child policy was eased, allowing 2 children per family. So far, though, there has been little sign of an uptick in the birth rate. Yan Ma is a single 30-year-old professional. She's based in Shanghai, and she's one of the many who seem reluctant to honour the government's entreaties to breed.
I don't feel personally interested or even affected by it because I've never really wanted a child. So it doesn't matter if it's a 2-children policy or 3 children or even more than that. In my generation, we don't see it as a compulsory thing. We have the freedom to say yes or no. And raising a child or even just having a child is an expensive thing. And it's not necessarily the only option for people to do right now. Like for my generation, we have a lot of things to go for. We have our career. We can choose whether we want a family life or not. I don't know. Many of my friends grew up in a family that they don't have siblings, and I think maybe some of them just get used to it.
So any of your friends, and you have friends with children, right? You have friends with 1 or 2 children already. Do you think the fact that the government has now given the green light to having a 3rd child is going to make any of those people you know have another child?
It would definitely not simply because of the policy itself. It would only because they already wanted more children, and that policy gives them the freedom to do so. But for those who only want 1 child or 2 children or don't want any children like me, it wouldn't change anything for us.
Yan Ma. So why is China introducing these measures anyway? The answer is, as ever, economic. In the next 5 years or so, China's population, currently at around 1.4 billion, is going to start declining. And like a lot of other countries in the world, it could decline pretty fast. Professor Stein Emil Volset is one of the authors of a new global population study that's been published in the Lancet newspaper.
The big picture results from the study were that the world population will peak in the mid-2060s, close to 10 billion, and then decrease to 8.8 billion in 2100. So in fact, we will still see a dramatic increase in the population of sub-Saharan Africa, while we will see a decrease in the total of Asia by 1 billion. That's going to happen very soon, and China, we forecast quite dramatic population declines in China, close to a halving of China's population between now and 2100.
Wow. I mean, a halving of China's population by 2100. And I can hardly imagine any country seeing declines that sharp over simply a couple of generations. Is that normal?
It's not normal, or it has not been normal, but what's going on all over the world at this point in time is that fertility, the number of children women have, is decreasing almost everywhere. There are many factors. In previous times, children helped the family economy. Today, children in economic terms may be a cost to families. Childcare, education. Also, more women are participating in the workforce, making it harder to have many children. And families who have children, they will also have parents and grandparents to take care of to a much larger extent than earlier.
Well, the irony is that these economic factors reducing women's fertility are now going to add to the economic burdens of future generations. Population decline is seen as a clear threat to economic growth. Take neighbouring Japan, for example, where a rapidly ageing population has, over 3 decades, been a crucial factor in economic stagnation.
The bigger threat to the Chinese economy and to Chinese society is this rapid aging process. And we know when we talk about healthcare spending, the most expensive part is in the close to death population and taking care of the elderly, and that cost will skyrocket.
That's Yong Kai, an associate professor at the University of North Carolina's Population Center. He says the pressure is now on to improve the country's social safety net.
China has expanded its social welfare system, for example, the pension system. How to pay for pension is a major concern because there is a larger proportion of elderly and, relatively speaking, smaller number of working age population.
So if you were advising a policymaker in China who wanted to encourage greater childbirth, where would you be looking to change policy to support young families?
I would say China is on the right footing as they announced the three-child policy. They pledged to provide broader social support, right, like better maternal and paternal leaves and child care facilities and beef up the pension system. They mentioned all those things. So in terms of policy, the question is about implementation, how much they can implement, make it effective.
Really? You think that they're announcing things, but they probably won't deliver?
It's much difficult to deliver. For example, China on the paper, there is already quite generous maternal leave policy, but the question is how many people can enjoy that kind of benefit. The Chinese society is very much segmented, those within the system, with pension, with all those benefits, and those working for private sectors, and the protection is, relatively speaking, minimal. That's why we compare them to slave laborers.
Professor Yong Kai. Well, the sceptical reaction that we heard earlier to the new three-child policy has been significantly airbrushed from the Chinese internet over the last couple of weeks. But journalist Mei Fong, who's now with Human Rights Watch and has written a book on the impact of the one-child policy, says that government edicts, cajoling and censorship are not going to change the core problem for the authorities. She says that even the new policy is confused. It targets only what it sees as the right kind of women to have more children in China.
There's a certain element of control there. It's not a free-for-all. As you know, there's been a studied move from 1 to 2 to 3. There hasn't been a lifting forth of all barriers. And that's partly because the heart of all of China's population planning policy was all about having the right kind of births. They want a certain kind of Chinese citizen to be born and raised to help the growth of the economy. So they want Han Chinese primarily. They want white-collar workers because they'll be more productive and more helpful to the knowledge economy. Working Chinese women, who are college educated. So there's a lot of messaging telling them that it is their duty to have more children, and they are the shining goddesses whose job it is to help the motherland grow. So that's clearly the demographic they want to go for. But all that we've learned from demographics, all we've learned of modern society, all we've learned of modern working families is that the tide is very, very hard to turn. It's very hard to increase births once we're in a downward slide.
Yeah, of course, China sets great store by its ability to persuade, perhaps coerce its population to do what the government wants.
Well, it's a lot easier to coerce people not to have children. It's a lot easier to take women away for a forced abortion. It is much, much harder from the practical basis to make people have children and make them raise them too. That's a whole long-running process involved there, and I don't think any government has figured it out. I mean, during the lockdown, for example, the actual, places that said, well, everybody stay home, so why don't you make more children for the motherland? And the birth rates are still very low, all around the world, not just in China. The lockdown did not result in a baby boom. So clearly that sort of messaging doesn't work.
It's been widely discussed over the decades by you and others, of course, the impact socially of single-child families all across China, particularly the wealthier urban areas where you'd had these little princelings, weren't they? They were called. Do you think that that's itself going to have an impact on people's attitudes to having larger families? I mean, those people are the ones who would now be of childbearing age, many of them, wouldn't they? They'd be the men and women choosing to have families right now, and many of them have grown up without siblings.
Oh, very much so. I mean, there's a lot of stories that have been talked about. Well, why is it that the Chinese people won't have more children? And there's a lot of factors cited, such as cost and the fact that it's a lot of work and, lack of society support. But the one factor that is very unique to China that you don't see in the rest of the world with declining populations, you don't see in Europe, for example, is propaganda. For 30 plus years, a whole generation has grown up with the idea that the one-child family is the best way to move forward. So for that to not stick, it would be a miracle. There would be a whole negation of the billion-dollar advertising industry, for example. And the other part of it is just a sheer practical constraint issue that is a result of the one-child family. I have interviewed very many single children who are now in their 30s and 40s. Those princelings that you referred to, they're not princelings now. They're having to take care of the children. They're having to take care of their parents and their grandparents in many cases, and all this without the benefit or help of siblings or a very supportive state system. So, for them, they are very aware of all these burdens, and many single children will say, I can't do it. I don't want to have more children. I have too much on my plate. It's a 4-2-1 structure, they call it. 4 grandparents, 2 parents, and 1. They are at the apex of this triangle.
I mean, is the state, you mentioned the state system, can the state not jump in and just throw better childcare provision, maternity, paternity leave options, all those kind of state supports that perhaps some in other countries get to support more children being born?
Well, that would certainly be the carrot approach versus the stick approach, which is what the Chinese Communist Party has historically employed. So far, it hasn't happened yet. I mean, that's why when they moved to a 2-child policy, they didn't accompany that switch with any real meaningful incentives. This is a very expensive system to do in order to, subsidize healthcare, subsidize childcare, subsidize schooling, for example. These are all very expensive things that typically wealthier nations can afford. The problem with China, and this is part of their one-child policy, is that they can't afford it so much because the saying in China has always been for a long time, we are going to get old before we get rich. China's population growth is falling at a time before it's reached that same kind of per capita GDP growth that more advanced economies have. When South Korea's population started falling, when Japan's population started falling, they were making much more in a per capita GDP, several times more than China. The problem is China's reached this rate much faster because of the one-child policy. So that is one reason why that all these very expensive policies potentially have not been put in place.
Journalist and author Mei Fong. Well, opinions vary as to how serious this demographic challenge is for the Chinese. They are, after all, in good company. Within a couple of decades, demographers reckon that every continent apart from Africa could be seeing declining populations. And that will lead many countries to start once again encouraging things like immigration to make up for certain types of labour shortages. Yong Kai at the University of North Carolina reckons maybe everyone, including the Chinese, should just accept that there will be fewer of us around, and that won't be entirely a bad thing.
Let's look at Japan as an example. Some people are very pessimistic about Japanese future. And at the same time, if you visit Japan society, I think in many ways is in a very good shape. people tend to measure everything using the GDP growth. But if we look at life expectancy, I think that's probably a better measure of human welfare, especially in facing the climate change. I think it's probably a wrong measure to measure everything in terms of growth, in terms of how much goods we consume.
So we should just ease up and enjoy the fact that there aren't going to be quite as many human beings on the planet.
I think certainly it's a concern for every country that fertility is no longer as high as it was in 1960s or 1970s. But I think at the same time we should celebrate our success, that we are living much longer and we have much better control of our destiny.
The opinion there of Professor Yong Kai at the University of North Carolina's Population Center. It is just one opinion, of course. The wider population switch from growth to rapid decline in most of the world's wealthier countries has got economists everywhere worried about how we're going to manage an increasingly aging population with fewer young people to look after them. It's a subject for other editions of Business Daily. But that's it for this one. Edwin Lane was the producer. More from us, same time on Monday.
Now on the BBC World Service, witness history with me, Rebecca Kesby. Over the past 40 years, China has witnessed massive economic growth. It's become known as the world's factory. The driving force behind much of it has been a vast migrant workforce of millions of people. Many